This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today, I'm delighted to have Dr. Bernard Munk with us. He, without question, is the expert who has the credentials and experience to talk about the market, corporate governance, and attempts to bring value to corporations. His long career spans academia and public service. Over his long career, he has been the owner and operator of trading companies and also production companies. He has been a financial advisor to private investors, hedge funds, and to family offices. Welcome to our show, Bernie.
Thank you very much, Sandra. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Now, Bernie, I understand that you're first going to talk about activists as opposed to market-driven changes in corporate control and corporate direction.
Well, I think I'd like to clarify something. I'd like to back up a little bit before we do that. What I've been studying is the paradigm between what goes on using markets for corporate governance and what goes on in the political side about governing politics. And that's my basic theme. And what I discovered after writing my book about corporate governance, which is called Disorganized Crimes, because these are not usually intended crimes, but they develop into a crime, is that the same kind of analytic structure that applies to understanding what goes wrong with corporations really can be transferred to the political market.
How so? Please.
Well, in both cases, what we're really studying are the incentives that operate on the principal actors in the drama. In the case of a corporation, you have a public, we're talking now only about public corporations. A public corporation is supposed to serve its shareholder interests. That's why people invest in it. So we hire a group of managers to run the corporation. And then because we're a little bit worried about what they're going to do, we have a board of directors, which they select, but the shareholders vote on technically. Unfortunately, there are very few liabilities for board members. So they have no great incentive to look deeply into corporate risk management. And usually our problems come with risk management. And the managers of the corporation for many years have been concerned with their own compensation. Well, there's a potential conflict between their compensation and the interest of the shareholders. And the real conflict comes in terms of the strategies and the techniques that the managers use to manage risk. If they take a lot of risk, they can get short-term gains, and if their compensation pays them for performance, there's an inherent conflict because the risks that they take are not fully disclosed to the shareholders who buy the stock. And that's really the central problem. The market can discipline the corporation if it has the information. But if it doesn't have the information, then you can have what we had in 2001 and 2 and in 2007 and 8.
And then you have, as you said, we have directors who have been selected by the managers who they're supposed to manage, and therefore are compensated by the same people.
Well, I've often, and I argued in my book, that if you want to solve that particular problem, make the directors liable. Managers are liable, but as you pointed out, and certainly we all understand, the rule of business judgment comes to play, and the courts tend not to punish managers very severely. You might ask the question why that's the case. Well, most of the corporations in the United States are Delaware corporations. Delaware derives its principal revenue from corporations. They're not going to bite the hand that feeds them, are they?
But even in New York, that's the case. Even if they're incorporated in New York.
Yeah, but you have to understand that and that's, now we're getting into the politics
Right.
side. And there's an incentive structure that works for the state boards or the boards in the, you know, in the Delaware, in the case of Delaware, but it's true throughout the United States. You know, corporate law, this is kind of a funny thing. We have no national corporate law. We only have state corporate law.
Interesting. No federal
Well, there's
law.
no, you know, when you register as a public company or as a private company with a corporation, you register with the state in which you want to have jurisdiction.
That's right.
But we have no national corporate organization. We have no national, we have no federal corporate structure. You can't be a federal
So
corporation.
it can't be sued in federal court.
Well,
Or
you
can
get to
they?
the federal courts if the proceedings in the state courts raise constitutional issues. That's how you get to the federal courts. But all I'm saying is you're asking a state board to do something it's not really comfortable in doing, because it has a relationship, a day-by-day relationship with the corporation. So anyway, what I'm going to suggest is that when you look at regulation, you have to realize that regulation does two things. Any regulation starts, I'm not talking about it on the federal level, any regulation starts with a legislative undertaking, which is passed by the two houses, sent to the president, signed off, but it doesn't have the rules and the regulations and the punishments for violating the law. That's written by the bureaucracy. It's written by professional and long-serving employees of the particular subject matter. If it's health, it's, you know, it's in a health ministry, and if it's commerce, or if it's petroleum, it's, you know, it's written by in the energy department, or it's written, you know, and all of those people are really permanent employees who have their own personal stake in seniority and advancement. And, you know, that's kind of like what a manager is to the shareholder. I mean, the voters don't have much say over what goes on in the bureaucracy. They can only change the legislator or the president. And now the president appoints the top 2 or 3 posts in each of these ministries, in each of these departments. And if he's dissatisfied with their performance, he can fire them and replace them. But he has to contend with what President Trump calls the swamp. And what we mean by the swamp is these are people who have lifetime employees, and they don't rotate very often.
Now, the person who the president appoints, does he have the power to appoint others,
Well,
like assistants?
he
or,
can't. Yeah, but he can't fire somebody in the department. That's a civil service issue. And the ironic thing about civil service, if you think about it historically, it came about from the first Roosevelt as president, Teddy Roosevelt. And the idea was to get away from what was then called the spoils system.
Yes.
And, you know, he who wins gets the spoils. So prior to the early years in the end of the 20th century, many people would come to Washington who were supporters of the winning party and say, I want a job. You know, this is terrific. And he thought this was not a good way to run the system.
But if you are a civil servant, don't you have to take a civil service examination to test whether you have competence of some knowledge of some sort?
Yeah, but each of those departments of the federal government have their own employment criteria by which they select people. But what you do notice is that they don't rotate very often. They stay in the same place, the same department. They may be promoted as senior level positions. So their interests really lie in a different way than a political appointee. Their interest is to be promoted to higher levels of compensation and responsibility. And who are they going to satisfy? They're going to satisfy the senior bureaucrats in that department. Now, it's a well-known fact that in Washington today, most of the employees, if you study their political affiliation, tend to be Democrats. That might not be true in a long run of Republican legislatures and presidencies, but that's what it is today. So in fact, when you get legislation, you have to write the rules. If the rules are uncomfortable to a particular corporate or NGO interest, then there's a negotiation that's going to go on between the regulators in writing the rules and a negotiation about how to enforce the rules. And the interesting thing to me is that whatever rule you choose, whatever regulation you write, you're going to create incentives to abide by the regulation, and you're going to create incentives to avoid the regulation. And that's a very difficult task for the voter to police. So in one way, markets are much more efficient in regulating how corporations run than voters are in running how the government runs.
One of the things I find very fascinating is how a piece of legislation could be 1,200 pages long.
Or how about 2,400 or 2,500 pages?
Would you explain that process?
Because there's negotiation always going on between the representatives of voters and of corporate interest, private business interest, through their lobbying activities to put in regulations which allow them to do one thing as opposed to doing something else. And so the writers of the legislation, who are actually bureaucrats that work for the Senate or the House committees, the lawyers that are attached to, they write the regulations.
But don't some of these associations, lobbyists, write pieces for them?
Well, the lobbyists have an influence because they interact, they sit at the table, so to speak. So if you think about what lobbying is, it's a market. In other words, it's a market for private interest to somehow negotiate the settlement of a particular legislative issue. So, I hire a lobbyist. The lobbyist comes to talk to the lawyers who work for the committees, and he comes to talk to the bureaucrats within the particular department who are going to enforce those regulations. And if you look at, for example, Graham-Dodd, you look at Graham-Dodd, which was the first big one,
yes,
which was done in 2001 and 2. We had a crisis. We had Enron go down. We had WorldCom go down. We had a number of other companies go down. So they said, well, what's wrong here? Well, what's wrong is that public accounting isn't done right, and the lawyers, the outside counsels are not doing their job, and so on. So they wrote regulations, but in fact, the problem with accounting was you never had term limits on who the public accountant was. So he had an interest in maintaining the client.
right.
What I suggested is, and others have certainly, there should be term limits for the accountant, for the certified accountants, but also for the credit monitoring issuance function as well. If you have rotation, then there's a finite lifetime to these professionals, and they don't want to be criticized by their successor. So suddenly, I think.
Suddenly they wake up.
Well, what you have is long-term interest being satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think is a big trouble today is that voters don't quite understand how little their individual vote means with regard to this process. They think that somehow, for example, that all of these issues are corrupted by businesses paying for lobbyists. But actually, the way I look at it is not every firm is on the same side of a regulation. They have different ways of operating, they have different interests, they have different capabilities. So they're all arguing for their own interest, and that's kind of like what you would expect in a market. The problem is the market's not very transparent, and it doesn't have accountability. But in the corporate world, if you're a shareholder, sooner or later there is accountability. If you don't perform, somebody will take over that corporation. In this case, there's nobody who's going to take over the bureaucracy. It will be the same bureaucrats. So I think that's an essential problem. And one of the outcomes of this is the intention to somehow change the electoral college system. Now there's a huge movement to change the electoral college system. Well, if you go back and read Madison's notes, and you read the writers who wrote the Federalist Papers, but also there's a whole coterie of writers who are on the anti-Federalist side. They were well aware of the problem, and they had different solutions. The Articles of Confederation, for example, have term limits in them.
But the Constitution has
didn't
none.
carry over to the Constitution. Why? Well, historians argue about that. My own interpretation, having thought about it a lot and read some of the work, they couldn't get it passed among the attendees of the Constitutional Convention. So they missed that. They missed the slavery question because they wouldn't be able to pass it and have the votes of the states to ratify the Constitution. And people criticized them, but, you know, there's a misunderstanding here. In 1787, many people thought slavery would die of its own accord. The only problem was that in 1793, a very bright man named Eli Whitney changed the game because he made plantation agriculture profitable again with the cotton gin. So people criticize the founders for not having an awareness. I think they had the awareness, they just made a political decision not to do it. And the Electoral College is, again, the sense of not succumbing to populism. Each state has a single vote. You have to win in the state. Now, that was their resolution of the problem they saw from ancient Greece and from Rome, because populism was very prevalent and destroyed Athens ultimately and destroyed the Republic in Rome. So they wrote something into it, being scholars of history. They were all very well-read men.
Yes. Particularly of Greece and Rome.
Well, they knew the ancient history.
Yes.
They had read many of the writers. You know, we often use Thucydides as the example of the great historian of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was a military commander that failed and was ostracized. That's why he wrote his history. Most people don't know that.
That's right.
You know, the same thing was true of Pythagoras. Pythagoras was ostracized. He was a commander. He was and probably the greatest mathematician of his time. You know, he could do calculus when the calculus wasn't even invented, and he didn't know algebra. So, you know, the Athenians had all the problems we have, but it was a much smaller state. And I think the other thing that's happened is we've grown to be a very large country. Think about it. We had 3 or 4 million people in the 18th century, and now we got 300 to 400 million people. So now there's a vast proliferation of self-interest that's all around the country.
Yes. So many different self-interests.
But self-interest is very human. You're not going to outlaw it very easily. I mean, what you have to do, if you want to reform things, you have to think of what incentives do I give in my regulations and rules that get the social outcome that I want. And that's the way to think about the problem.
Would you like to give a few examples?
Well, let's take, for example, the recent efforts by the Congress to induce consumption behavior and business behavior given COVID. So what do? They wrote a whole series of subsidies paying people because they would lose their job. But the payment system they put in doubled what they would get from working. So you've given an incentive to people not to come back to work because they're getting more money by staying out of work. Now, when that vanishes, you'll see employment go up because they won't have that extra income. That was kind of a strange device, but it was politically very popular, and so it was passed. The only problem is it leaves the taxpayer with a hangover that'll last for 50 or 100 years into the future. I'm not saying that we don't want to somehow bring back consumers and businesses. I'm saying that the problem is we've let the concern for health care outweigh our concern for getting the economy back in order. And I think that most scientists would say the healthcare problem will get solved sooner or later, but it's not clear if we don't get the economy back together how long it will take to bring us back. You know, revival can take a long, long time. You lose hundreds of thousands of businesses, even small, and particularly small businesses. They're, you know, what's small today may become very large. After all, in 1990, how big was Amazon? How big was Google? There was no Facebook.
And on the other hand, with the small businesses, they need to have capital, someone to.
Which means you have to get the economy working again so capital can be raised.
Yes.
And that's another side of bureaucratic policy. We have a Federal Reserve, which is its own bureaucracy. I mean, I spent a year at the Fed early in my career at the board, and they're no different than any other bureaucracy. Yeah, they're highly qualified, but if they all think alike, you get the absence of diversity within the thinking process.
Do you think that Powell is the person who is different from the rest of the crowd?
No, I think the crowd they're all marching to the same music now. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you read the speeches and if you read the reports of the very fine staff, they're not doing all the work. There's more work that could be done which focuses on a different kind of economic action, a different kind of economic analysis. I don't want to go deeply into that because it's very complicated. But why would we think that bureaucracy would work differently than any other?
Now, what points do you think the general public should remember? What are the most important things?
Well, I think the most important thing is to understand you got human beings involved, and they have motivations, and those motivations are not different from the public's motivations. I want higher income, I want more security, I want more health care, and so on. And incentives govern the process. So when you write regulations, you have to think about what you're incentivizing. Is the behavior you're likely to get the behavior you want to get? And I think, for example, you've asked me before about environmental legislation. Well, you have very powerful NGOs today that have a big influence on environmental legislation. Corporations are not indifferent to that. They're not polluters by the nature of the corporation. They look at the liabilities and they look at the benefits, and they make their decision accordingly. I think a perfectly good example of all this is our educational policy. Think about it. The teachers' union is the teachers' unions are some of the most powerful NGOs in the United States. have massive voter impact. Why should they be the people who dictate what your health policy is going to be? Because when we don't educate our children,
Maybe because they're afraid they'll be sued.
well, no, but the point is that if we don't educate our children, we have a long-term disability problem. And the interesting thing is that most of that falls on the poorest section of the community, because the wealthiest section can buy into private schools. So public school education, which should be the concern of all of people who are worried about poverty, is hurt when schools don't open. And you say, well, we just have a health problem. We do. But the health problem can be mitigated to some extent, and it shouldn't be the teacher's call to say when the schools go to open.
Well, you have someone at the head of the Board of Education. You have the person who appoints the head of the Board of Education. You have, at the federal level, you have the Secretary of Education, et cetera.
But the secretary has no control over the public schools.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a local right. I mean, that's written into the Constitution. You know, what are not federal rights automatically are states' rights. So the governors have more impact than the federal legislators by far, or the federal bureaucrats.
Didn't the Constitution give the states power over health?
Yes,
Specifically?
Correct. And, you know, the criticism of this administration is they didn't do anything early in the game, but actually it was a state, that's really a state function. So
And that's rather interesting. I want to thank you so much, Bernie, for coming on our show.
Okay.
You've been very, 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 well, let's say this. You've given the public a different insight that they don't normally hear.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that they will think about some of these things. Even though they're very remote, they really have an impact on their own personal lives.
Until the next time, this is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.
Are we on or off?
We've just